I am not the same for having seen the moon shine on the other side of the world. With these simple words, Mary Ann Rodmacher captures the essence of what it means to travel.
Traveling means so much to me. It means helping me gain perspectives outside of my own, break out of my comfort zone, and really challenge how I think about the world.
It just means getting to experience new things in places that are unfamiliar to me. It's about learning new things, trying new things, just about everything that's new.
Stepping into places unknown requires both courage and vulnerability because you risk having everything from your beliefs to your identities called into question. Never was this more clear to me than when I spent a semester abroad. I encountered people whose cultures and views fell across a vast spectrum of beliefs. But sometimes these beliefs collided directly with elements of my own self, complicating my quest to become a global citizen more than I had ever anticipated. When we travel, what happens when our desire to be a global citizen and our own identities come into conflict? I was fortunate enough to be raised in a family that understood the value of travel, and even more fortunate to have had opportunities to do so. I always knew I'd want to spend a semester overseas in college. I stumbled across Semester at Sea, which offered students a chance to live aboard a ship and travel to multiple countries and continents in the span of just a few months. In preparation for my trip, I spent some time thinking about the concept of global citizenship. Scholars debate definitions and even whether it can be defined at all. He sees being a global citizen as being on an ongoing journey towards a better understanding of the world, but not a quest to belong everywhere or to call everywhere your own.
Being a global citizen, to me, means carrying around with you at all times this sense of understanding and this sense of curiosity about others and the way that they think. And I think even if somebody has these, values and beliefs that are so very different from yours, I think that we can all find a sense of community and a sense of humanity in understanding the way that these beliefs and values come about.
Global citizenship means trying to understand my place in the broader world. I think it also means challenging the perceptions that I hold and understanding that they come from a biased and ignorant reality.
To me, global citizenship means recognizing that we're all part of the same planet, but also recognizing that there are tremendous differences and that those need to be honored and understood in order for the well-being of everyone on the planet to the greatest extent possible.
Another writer, Truing White, writes about transformative global citizenship, when achieving its full potential, comes not only with a desire to understand multiple perspectives, but also to offer a critical analysis. Do I have a right to offer a critical analysis of a culture that isn't mine? Wasn't the whole point of being a global citizen to be open-minded and not judged? My definition of global citizenship would change many times over the course of my journey. Embarkation day finally arrived. It would be 2 weeks at sea before we arrived in our first country. Our professors challenged us to strive to be a global citizen throughout our travels, but also to expect obstacles as we encountered cultures far from our own. For the first time, I began to understand the identity element of this concept.
I think that anyone who identifies as any type of queer or gay or, anything like that, definitely something that they always think about, even when I'm not traveling. And it was really hard at some points because when we're traveling, you have to remember that culture there isn't always the same, and you just kind of have to take a step back and really look at where you are.
The next 10 days were spent at sea, with plenty of time to anticipate our arrival in our first foreign port, Japan. Class was spent learning about Asian culture, how it compared to the West, what was to be expected when we disembarked, and what would be expected of us, Japan. I never experienced any discomfort for existing a certain way. Both of my excursion tour guides were women, we encountered religious diversity of all kinds, and friends of mine even attended a lecture at a local university about LGBT rights. This relatively high level of tolerance, we were told by some members of the staff, shouldn't be expected everywhere. The farther away we went from home, the more different the places we'd visit would be. Some global education practices tend to emphasize an awareness of distant others, therefore reinforcing a them versus us mentality at the expense of linking local and global challenges. precaution of othering was very much on my mind as I stood on the deck in the middle of the night and watched us pull into China, a place that one staff member had referred to as being strictly rooted in tradition. While walking the streets of Shanghai, we decided to duck into a small hole-in-the-wall bar to grab a drink and warm up. The bartender, Lucy, was overjoyed to have customers so late at night, and even more excited to hear that we were American. Quickly pulling out a picture of several visitors, while showing us the photo, she pointed to a guy in the center and told us, "And this one, he had a husband. He was gay." She followed this with, "We don't have gays in China very much because it's so different and it's hard to understand. Well, what would you do if you knew someone who was gay like that?" After thinking for a moment, I finally said, "You know, the way I see it, if people are happy and love each other, it doesn't affect me." She was really surprised at this, as if she'd expected me to toy with the idea and give a more mixed answer, but not surprised so much as in opposition. She told us that in China, there were not a lot of gay people, to her knowledge, mainly because China is so traditional in practices and values. But when she was talking, she wasn't speaking about it in a negative way, just very matter-of-factly. I could tell, even in a short conversation with her, that she simply couldn't place a concept like homosexuality. The fact that she was thinking actively about this concept and wanted to know our thoughts and was subconsciously juggling her own traditions with what her gut told her gave me a tremendous amount of hope for future generations, especially in cultures that may be seen as oppressive, but are perhaps just behind the times more than teaching their kids to oppress. En route to Vietnam, our shipboard community played host to a few visitors from our upcoming port, one of which was a student named Toby. We had a common interest in social justice, travel, and cultural studies, and compared our backgrounds in these topics and how they've shaped our paths. Toby mentioned the fact that he and a group of friends had pioneered the first LGBT student group at his university, so later that night, I invited him to a meeting of our own semester at LGBT Club. When he joined us, he took the time to tell how it's been through the effort of his generation that times have begun to change and his culture has begun to emphasize the positives of differences. Toby asked us about the types of conversations we have with our families, and we found many similarities across our cultures.
The most impactful cultural experience I had on the trip intersected with my identity as being American. When I was in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, we met with a Viet Cong veteran, and he was a school teacher. And then the United States military blew up the school that he was teaching in, and he saw a lot of his kids die. And it really challenged my perception of what I think of a hero and, ideas of good and bad and good and evil. In the United States, I've been raised to believe that our military is the most heroic force out there.
When I found myself outside of the entrance to a Buddhist temple, face to face with a sign that said, "Ladies do not enter," I was unprepared, to say the least. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that all the other women around me were accepting this restriction without question, not bothered by the fact that we had spent the same amount of money as our male counterparts to see this exhibit. As the boys in our group waltzed past the sign without a second look, my anger continued to build. Were our men really not bothered by the blatant oppression they had just witnessed? But as I sat there, it occurred to me that I might be viewing the situation with the same one-dimensional perspective that I was taking issue with, and I knew better than to be reacting to a cultural difference with anger. I also reminded myself of Myanmar's recent history of trauma. It would make sense for the women of Myanmar to be so hesitant to protest traditional ways of living. The more I searched and was able to come up with reasons for this sign's existence, the more I felt shame for my initial reaction of anger. Plus, it was not my place to pass judgment on the surface of a culture that was not my own. Who was to say that these local women who adhered to the sign were not infuriated by it, or that the men were aware of their privilege, but not in positions where they felt they could stand up for equality? Global citizenship seemed achievable when things were smooth sailing, so to speak, but when the waters got choppier and the feelings of oppression entered the scene, it became much more difficult to remain an objective observer.
I think the most impactful cultural experience that I had on the trip took place in India. We went to a rural village. We spoke to these leaders of the community. These powerful men from this village were talking over these female performers. There were very blatant forms of sexism that I could see. We moved from that, and in the afternoon we ended up in this university setting. There were 3 men on the panel and 1 woman on the panel. And the woman in the panel she was studying what we were learning about directly in this class. All of the men went before the woman, and the woman who we really wanted to hear from, she got to speak for maybe 3 minutes. It was definitely very interesting, being a woman in these 2 very different settings, and it made me kind of reflect some of the things that go on in the United States and some of these inequalities and inequities, because it's not just singular to India, it's not just singular to places in that region, it's everywhere.
After India, we left Asia behind and headed for Africa.
I very much externally will, on days dress very masculine, and being in a very conservative culture, I very much didn't look like I fit. So there were a couple of kind of funny experiences where, I'd have a man laugh at me on the train, an old man who just hasn't seen somebody like me. Nobody really looks at me twice or does a double take when I walk by. I think that that's something that I took for granted. And so a lot of the experiences that I had from my identities made me very grateful for a lot of the privilege.
My existence in general kind of was a conflict in some cultures. I'm gay and I'm also a woman, and in a lot of places you just can't be that, and in a lot of places women aren't as respected or looked on upon in great lights.
Our final stop before heading for Europe at the end of our voyage was Morocco, the first and only predominantly Arabic nation we were to visit. I packed a scarf in my bag in case we were to go to any places of worship, and sure enough, it was one of our first stops. However, all our guide told us to do was to remove our shoes before going in, though I saw the rest of the women were covering their heads. When I asked him if this was something we should be doing, he replied, "It is expected of the locals because they know the customs. All we ask of foreigners is that they show modesty and respect. It is about intent and not knowledge." This perspective of his, which seemed to be agreed upon by many, both here in Morocco and in the previous countries we had visited, seemed to me the epitome of global citizenship. No doubt we stood out by not having our heads covered, just as we must have stood out in ports before. But the locals saw that we were trying to honor the way that things were done, and that was enough for them. Lucy was trying to understand diversity, and that was enough for me. Toby's peers were trying to wrap their minds around identity, and that was enough for him. We were making an effort to be part of a community bigger than our own, and that was what truly mattered.
I think the biggest benefit of traveling is the fact that you have to constantly adapt your worldview. When you see something in a culture that's different from yours, instead of just remarking it as weird or strange or outside of my box, you have to realize that this is the way that people live. To have to accommodate the way that you look at the world, you kind of add another lens.
When I first set out on my journey, I thought being a global citizen meant adopting the ways of whatever culture I was currently immersed in, and attempting to see the world through the eyes of its people. Now I realize that it's far more complicated than that, but also far more simple. Global citizenship boils down to this: a desire to learn about the world. This doesn't require submission or the erasure of your core identities. It just requires an open mind and the ability to contextualize.
Most people my age have not gone to this many places and got to experience so many things in such a short span of time, but I'm really grateful for that.
My time on semester at sea was the most rewarding 100 days of my life. The places I saw, the people I met, and the stories I heard changed me as a person, and I can only hope to do them justice by continuing my ongoing quest to be the best global citizen I can be.